Railroads not only transformed industrial cities in the East, but also in the West. This transformation happened primarily because travel had become easier, cheaper, and safer. The transcontinental lines moved people, grain, cattle, ore, and equipment across the vast expanses of the Midwest, over the Rocky Mountains and the Sierra Nevada, and to the fertile valleys of California and Oregon. The Homestead Act. Although Americans had continued to move in a steady stream westward, even during the Civil War, this phenomenon picked up steam once the war had ended. Several million Americans surged into the great unknown regions beyond eastern Kansas and Nebraska. Settlers particularly wanted cheap federal land offered by Congress in the Homestead Act of 1862. For a small fee, any settler could take out a 160-acre western claim so long as he and his family improved the land by farming it and living on it for at least 5 years. The Native American Wars. In 1881, author Helen Hunt Jackson published her book, A Century of Dishonor, a book that described the federal government's history of cruelty toward Native Americans over the previous 100 years. The book launched a new debate about whites' relationship with Native Americans and prompted many people to conclude that assimilation would be the only solution to the problem. The Sioux Wars? As white settlers pushed farther and farther westward, they repeatedly shoved Native Americans off their lands. Not surprisingly, the two groups frequently clashed. In 1864, for example, Union troops slaughtered several hundred Native American women and children at the Sand Creek Massacre in Colorado. The U.S. Army also fought the Sioux tribes in the Black Hills of Dakota Territory during the 1860s and 1870s. These battles were dubbed the Sioux Wars. Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer made his infamous last stand during this war at the Battle of Little Bighorn, when more than 250 of his troops fell under the hands of Chief Sitting Bull and his warriors in 1876. The Sioux victory was short-lived, and they were defeated a year later. We are very lucky to have Chief Joseph with us here today. Namaste. Namaste, yes. Okay. Chief Joseph, what was your goal?
I didn't want to let the whites have my land without putting up a fight.
Thank you. The Dawes Severalty Act. In order to make room for more whites, the federal government first tried to herd Native American natives onto tribal-owned reservations on the forest land in the Dakotas, New Mexico, and Oklahoma. Under pressure from reformers who wanted to acclimatize Native Americans to white culture, Congress eventually passed the Dawes Severalty Act in 1887. The Dawes Act outlawed tribal ownership of land and instead forced 160-acre homesteads into the hands of Indians and their families with a promise of future citizenship. The act tried to forcibly assimilate Native Americans into white culture as quickly as possible. Transformations in agriculture. Investors and land speculators followed close behind the rugged homesteaders who had staked their claims in the great unknown and also had a share in transforming the West. Agricultural prices remained relatively high during the good times between the Depression of 1873 and the Depression of 1893. So many farmers with a little capital switched from subsistence farming to growing single cash crops. In the Midwest, growing only wheat or corn or raising cattle to maximize profits in the cities was common for farmers. The plight of small farmers. The incorporation of farming, high protective tariffs, and the Depression of 1893 ruined subsistence farmers in the Midwest and South. Many of the cash crop farmers found themselves deep in debt and couldn't afford the unregulated railroad fares to ship their products to cities. More than 1 million impoverished farmers eventually organized under a social organization called the National Grange to fight for their livelihood. They managed to win some key victories in several Midwestern legislatures, supported by the Greenback Party in the 1870s and the Populist Party in the 1890s. The rise and fall of populism. Then, the rise and fall of populism came about. Benjamin Harrison's McKinley Tariff was one of the highest tariffs in U.S. history, even higher than the 1828 tariff of abominations that had nearly split the Union. The tariff particularly hurt farmers in the West and South, who sold their harvests on unprotected markets and bought expensive manufactured goods. The Populists. In seeking revenge for the McKinley Tariff, the farmers voted Republicans out of the House of Representatives in the 1890 congressional elections. Some of them even formed a pseudo-political party in the late 1880s called the Farmers Alliance. By the time the 1892 elections rolled around, the alliance had merged with other liberal Democrats to form the Populist Party. Populist nominated former Greenback Party candidate James B. Weaver and campaigned for the following: cheap silver money, government ownership of all railroads and telephone companies, a graduated income tax, direct election of U.S. senators, single-term limits for presidents, immigration restriction, shorter workdays. Grover Cleveland was then elected twice. The Republicans and Democrats again nominated Benjamin Harrison and Grover Cleveland, respectively, for the presidency in 1892. Weaver and the Populists also entered the race, as did John Bidwell on behalf of the fledgling Prohibition Party. The Populists did surprisingly well and managed to receive more than 1 million popular votes and 22 electoral votes. I'm so lucky to have President McKinley here with us today.
Grover Cleveland. I'm Grover Cleveland.
Yes. You have a great resemblance to President McKinley, Mr. Cleveland. So, Mr. Cleveland, tell me, what makes your presidency special?
You see, I served 2 consecutive terms. I was the only president to do so.
Fascinating. Yes. Thank you.
I also was here when we had the Depression of 1893, which was the worst depression that the country had ever seen up to that point.
It's terrible. Thank you.
Thank you.
Silver, gold, and J.P. Morgan. Even worse, the federal government had nearly gone bankrupt. Wily investors had traded their silver for gold in a convoluted scheme that ultimately depleted the nation's gold reserves below $100 million. Had this trend continued, the government would not have had enough gold to back the paper currency in circulation or prevent the economic collapse that would have resulted. Cleveland addressed the situation by repealing the 1890 Sherman Silver Purchase Act to prevent the loss of any more gold. This had no effect, and by the following year, the government had only $41 million in the treasury. Cleveland and Congress ultimately appealed to Wall Street financier J.P. Morgan to bail them out. For a hefty price, Morgan agreed to loan the government $62 million to put it back on its feet. Coxey's Army. The Depression of 1893 and Cleveland's repeal of the Sherman Silver Purchase Act only made the populist movement stronger. More and more disillusioned Democrats flocked to the Populist Party in hopes of winning free silver and more power for the people. The Depression also encouraged other would-be reformers to cry out for change. The wealthy Ohioan Jacob S. Coxey petitioned the government for cheap money and debt relief programs. When Coxey's army reached the capital in 1894, however, city officials arrested them for marching on the grass. Islands in the Pacific. After the U.S. Census Bureau declared the continental frontier closed in 1890, Americans began looking overseas to expand. A number of islands in the Pacific Ocean became the first to fall under colonization and the American flag. Hawaii was the plum of the Pacific for its pleasant climate, which was perfect for growing sugarcane. Americans had been settling in Hawaii and living with the native islanders for more than 100 years. The white American minority had repeatedly petitioned Congress for annexation and had even overthrown the peaceful Hawaiian Queen Liliuokalani to seize control of the government in 1893. Outraged, the anti-expansionist Grover Cleveland rejected annexation and condemned the revolt against the Queen. Cleveland upholds the Monroe Doctrine. Cleveland also threatened war with Great Britain over a territorial dispute in South America, one that didn't even involve the U.S. territory. Both Venezuela and the British colony of Guyana claimed a huge tract of land rich with gold ore along the border. Invoking the Monroe Doctrine, Cleveland threatened the British with war if they didn't back off. Eventually, Britain acquiesced. They sought arbitration to settle the dispute, not so much because they feared the United States, but because they didn't want to alienate a potential ally as European relations grew increasingly chillier. Cleveland's bold stance impressed many Latin American nations, who began to see the United States as a friendly protector. Cut.